blessed new year to you guys. Welcome to the Free Mind Podcast.
Season 4, yo.
4.
Hey, yo. Hey, yo.
Are the stars out tonight? I don't know if it's cloudy or bright.
All right, well, it's been a minute. Long story short, we'll talk about it more in this season probably at some point, but your boy's been going to renovation school, doing some manly work, some demolition, some building up.
Hard project.
You know, that's the thing that happens when you don't really know what you're doing is you end up having to redo things a lot. And so I got a lot of redoing going on, but thankfully
but it turned out great. It's
turned
awesome.
out great. So you see this this brick wall if you're watching us on the YouTube or even better yet on Rumble. You'll see this brick wall that I took the plaster off with a jackhammer. That was just, this is a little part of like the whole house. So we'll show you guys more later, but eventually we'll have more back here. But we're phase 1 of the of our little studio here in our home. So yeah, but basically 3 months of that. Now we're trying to get back at hopefully hopping on more podcasts here. And so much to talk about.
Lots.
Crazy stuff going on.
Yeah.
So, but we thought for this one, we kind of give like a little bit just of an intro, maybe a summation. Where have we been? I think season 3 we started. Where do we go from here? I feel like we're still kind of in that conversation. So it's like maybe this will be an extension of that topic more than anything. But I was just thinking back and like, you know, you always reflect going into the new year.
True.
So we're getting into 2023 and I'm like, man, you know, we started this podcast. I don't even remember. Was it 2018, 19, something like that? And how much has even happened since then? And, you know, I think you were saying this the other day, like we were on the phone with a friend last night and you were like, man, has it always been this crazy? Or like,
fair question.
Yeah. What was your
you know, it's like things are being revealed and brought to light and you're like, man, has it always been this bananas? Or is it just that the social media and media outlets are highlighting it and people are becoming more aware of the crazy?
Yeah.
But it does feel like it's a different era.
Is it something new, or is it like you moved a stone out of the way, or like in this renovation process I disturbed a nest of sorts, and like this one guy was painting and these wasps came out and attacked him.
Yes.
You know, they had been there for a while but they were hidden, you know.
Right.
which one is going on here.
I was wondering that. Yeah.
And what is really going on, you know, there's so many fault lines happening within the Christian world, so many things happening outside of the quote unquote, I mean, there's nothing really outside of God's world, but outside of the church world, there's all these kinds of things happening as well. So it can be hard to know, like, where do we go from here? What do we do if you don't know where we're at, like on the map? Like you don't want to, like, do we go left, right, east, west, north, south? You know, well, it depends on where we are and it depends on where we're going. So the craziness of this time has really, I think, made us reconsider our theology in a lot of ways. Like it's taken us deeper and deeper to more of the core issues, I think, of like what is the mission of the church? Like what is God doing in the earth? What does it mean? What does the Great Commission really mean? Is it just souls? Like, are we just to, you know, rescue people off this sinking ship? And maybe at best are we to help them, you know, develop peace and patience and the fruits of the Spirit? Is that the extent of it? Or should it impact marriage? Should it impact education? Should it impact civil government? Like, what are all those things? It's made us really rethink that. And so we started, I think, hitting on those issues last season a little bit, but I think I want to even expand that and drill down on some of those things this season in a even more detailed manner. And so we have been on this journey as well. Like, it's made us rethink our thinking in some areas. Some things it's kind of confirmed. Other things it's like, okay, I was on this kind of position, but I moved over here to this. Always trying to see what does God say about this, and then trying to apply that to the situation we're in. So anyways, Nirva had been reading this book. She's been in the C.S. Lewis book clubs over the past few years, and you guys started reading one called The Abolition of Man.
Yes. I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan, not an expert, but a lover of his writing and his books. And I just love his ability to see into the future and look at different movements and can kind of tell where they lead and what the end outcome is of these various things that were like popular in his day that seemed like trends, but he could foresee, okay, this leads to this, and this is why this is important.
Yeah.
And so this book,
he's a very gifted thinker, like prophetic, not in the prophetic sense, like of that term, like you would see in the Bible where God's, giving revelation from heaven, but like prophetic in the sense that he could see, like he would be at letter B and he could see Q or R or S down the alphabet. Like where are these ideas coming from? Where are they leading to?
For sure.
He was a gifted thinker like that, and really did foresee a lot of what we're going through now. And that's why many people, like, this book keeps coming back up. Here's our little copy of it, if you can see it here. And interestingly enough, the subtitle of it is kind of, this is how they used to write. This is funny because it says The Abolition of Man, or Reflections on Education with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of school.
Upper forms of school, gosh.
Their subtitles were a little bit more, I don't know if they'd work in this TikTok generation. You might lose someone by, word 4 on that subtitle, but... Yeah. What was going on, he was seeing something that was happening at the level of education with the primary schools, that he said, man, if these kids are influenced by this, it's going to lead to the abolition of man, the actual like deleting of the nature of man down the road. And I think, was this essays originally? Was it lectures?
Formed from a couple essays,
right.
And it's a response to a children's book that his peers had written, and so there were some ideas in that book that he could foresee if this catches on and spreads.
Yes,
it could be.
Basically, some of it, like the ideas in here, and we're not going to do like a deep dive on this particular book today because it would be worth it in the future, but I think we're just going to kind of lay out some of the broad themes and try to quickly apply it to some things that are going on to give us a better idea of like what he saw and how this book is so relevant right now. It keeps coming up, like I said, like everybody's bringing it up because it's so relevant. So, was the Green Book or something that he was responding to, something called the Green Book, or I can't remember what it was called, but basically, one of the examples early on in the book that he's talking about is somebody's looking at a waterfall, and they see the waterfall and they say, man, this waterfall is sublime or something like this. Like, this is an amazing waterfall. And the guys that are educating the kids are saying, well, the waterfall isn't sublime. You're projecting sublimity onto the waterfall. So what they did in that movement, they were subjectivizing beauty and saying, no, beauty is only in the eye of the beholder. And you'll hear that phrase often. Well, on the heels of that, what Lewis is saying, like throughout this book, apparently they were subjectivizing the three great, I don't know if you call it, not the trivium, but the thing that people talk about as truth, goodness, and beauty. So they were really subjectivizing reason itself and aesthetics itself, and even morality. So those three fundamental things of philosophy. And he said, basically, if you do this, you're going to get rid of man. He had this concept he talked about called the Tao. And he used that term just briefly. I think was it a Chinese term or something that he borrowed? I'm not sure about the history of the term, but it was he didn't want to necessarily use. He correlated it to what we sometimes call natural law in Christian theology. Or just, traditional morality, but he didn't want to use those terms. One reason was brevity, like the Tao is just simple to say, it's quick, one syllable word. But another reason was to emphasize the universality of it, to say this isn't merely for Christians or church people.
Right.
Like the Tao is something that relates to every human being.
Right. Even outside of Christianity, that the natural law or the objectivizing of just values was written on people's conscience, and that in different cultures and different expressions, people had a sense of right and wrong.
Yes, and that's what we see really in Romans 1 and 2, right? Paul says that's become a part of Christian theology, was that like God's invisible attributes, his characteristics are clearly perceived by what he's created. And then I think it's I forget which verse in Romans 2, but he talks about the law being written on the heart even of the Gentiles. So there's that part where God's existence is made clear, his nature is made clear, and because that, like, we can discern certain things about our natures being made in his image, and even the moral law itself being written on the heart of people who don't necessarily, like the Gentiles who didn't necessarily have special revelation, quote unquote, from God. This general revelation could be found, and that's what Lewis in essence captures by the Tao. Some people have kind of summarized, because he has a really philosophical definition that he gives.
Oh gosh, and I could barely follow it. I've read it 10 times, and it's just so philosophical and beyond. Beyond me. But it does. He does he's got 3 chapters in the book, and the first chapter is called The Way. The second is I think Men Without Chest, and then the third chapter is The Abolition of Man. And by the end of the third chapter, it's like it's so brilliant, and he's just really making the case for what you're capturing here, like what you're expressing, what he calls the rational universality of objective values that got embedded into the universe. Exactly. The objective rational. And those both of these points are important. The objective rational and moral order, like you said. Embedded in the universe. So it's like this cosmos, this ordered realm that God created. And some people have tied that, many people have tied that to the Logos, like this idea that in the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Logos was God. He was with God, and the Logos was God. The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. Like this oral, somehow this order in the cosmos was actually attached to the nature of Christ. Like people have sort of cashed that out, but the idea here is that God made these creational norms that every human being to some level can perceive, and they suppress those in unrighteousness is the testimony of Romans about fallen man. And so what Lewis was pointing out, though, was he said something unique was happening in his time that he said hadn't happened really in Western civilization, and maybe not even in the history of the world. He said what was going on was this Tao, this rational and moral order embedded in the cosmos, was starting to be rejected wholesale. And he saw that at the level of education. It hadn't yet bloomed and affected the whole of society. But what he pointed out, he began to say, man, if you take this viewpoint, if you relativize beauty, if you relativize reason, here's what it leads to. It leads to this awful picture. And so I would leave it, like, if you have a chance to read this book and really wrestle with it, it's really worth going through. But why is that so important? Because Lewis was saying that even the pagans lived what he called like within the Tao, like non-Christian religions. He argues that even like Hindus and Muslims, like to a degree, they kept elements of that. Like there was still an objective kind of thing, and there were subjectivists and relativists in history, that kind of thing. But he really caches the idea that what was going on in this time in England was planting the seeds that could actually destroy Western civilization. Some like really an existential threat, not just an ideological threat, and not merely a threat to biblical Christianity. Like this, if adopted, he said it will completely destroy Western civilization. So now, okay, put that on the shelf for a second. We were listening to Canon Plus app, and by the way, like they're not a sponsor or anything like that, but I would say if you can do one streaming service this year, like cancel your Disney Plus if you need to. If you don't have the money, or cancel your Netflix and get Canon Plus, and watch their videos with your family, discuss it, because they're really putting out incredible good material
content on these types of issues. But they recently posted a conference. It was called The Negative World.
Okay.
They had three speakers, and the first speaker is a guy named Aaron Renn, and he basically lays out these three stages that he saw in kind of recent American history, okay? So the first stage he calls positive world, then neutral world, then negative world. So he says positive world basically captured by the picture of the 1950s. In positive world, you know, you may have people rejecting certain elements of particular Christian doctrine, like they might not believe in the virgin birth, or, you know, they might kind of balk at, you know, the exclusivity of Christ. But by and large, during that time, Christianity was still seen and viewed by the public as a positive element in society. Like a good churchman was still looked up to as like, oh yeah, he's a good Christian, and that was a respected, positive thing. He said about he locates the shift to the neutral world in about 1994. And he says about 94, we shifted into neutral world, which he describes as basically Christianity became one of many options, like on a buffet, a religious buffet. Okay. Sort of like the pluralistic idea. And that now you like Christianity, it's not really like a positive thing, but it's not negative. It's like, okay, you like you know, you like cold brew, which is terrible, by the way. I like, you know, lattes. Yeah. It's all good. Okay. And we coexist. You know, it's the coexist bumper sticker.
Neutral. Okay.
So that's neutral world. And he said we were there basically roughly till about 2014. He locates Obergefell, the passing of same-sex marriage, as sort of the time around when it shifted to negative world. And so Aaron Renn, like, he makes the case that from around that time, Christianity not only began to be seen as like a neutral kind of like unique option among many, but now it became, you started to be seen as a really negative force, a negative moral force. So, and he gives the example like, you know, if you were to put like, I'm a strong Christian on your resume in Silicon Valley, that would probably keep you from getting the job. Or it would hurt your chances rather than help them. My. It wouldn't even be neutral. So is Silicon Valley and that Hollywood and that stuff has started to influence more and more of just regular American society. That mentality has kind of spread, and now Christianity becomes seen as bigoted and racist and nationalist and all these types of things.
World.
So does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. Those three classifications.
So positive to neutral to negative world. And we're now living in the negative.
Yes. And he illustrates it with three examples of presidents, and I forget which in the positive world it was like they had to hide this one, maybe it wasn't a president, but it was a governmental official. Maybe it was a president, I can't remember. Anyways, they had to hide his affair because they knew it would hurt his political chances if he was found out. He said, like, fast forward to the neutral world with Bill Clinton, there was still like a scuffle about it, but it was like he basically recovered from it, even though he did this thing publicly in the White House, and was still basically fine politically. To fast forwarding, he uses Trump as like the paradigmatic example of this guy's been married 3 times, you know, this thing. And, you know, people didn't bat an eye. Like, even those Hollywood tapes came out a few days for election, he still won. And he said that was a bit ironic because the people that really served to undermine the Dow were the people that hated his election the most. So the very thing they worked toward was the very thing that ironically came back to bite them in the end. But anyways, so he illustrated the shift in this kind of movement with those 3 cases. Now, the guy that got up to speak after him actually offered what I think was a good clarification of Aaron's thing. So he was talking about Christianity, basically the positive, neutral, and negative world toward Christianity. And some of the pushback he was getting from some people was that, you know, well, the Christianity's always been seen as negative in the world, right? Because Christ says, you know, in this world they will hate you, this and that. So, like, basically, it's always been negative. Like, there was no positive and neutral. That was just an illusion, was one of the pushbacks that he was getting. But I think we all recognize that something has shifted, especially in America. So what is that thing? Even though that is true, like real genuine Christianity is most often doesn't fit in the world, in the fallen world of man. But it has been a shift. So the second guy, when he clarified, he said, really what the major shift was when it shifted into a negative world was not the particular Christian doctrines that were coming under fire. It was the Tao. So he said the rejection of the Tao that finally came into bloom, what Lewis saw in the Abolition of Man, finally, like, it's like a...
So he's using that same...
Yeah, he's using
definition. Okay.
So basically, where like
the universality of objective values and truth.
Yes, built into the creation itself. So the creational norms.
Oh, yes. Okay, I see what you're saying.
So in essence, he says, like, whereas in the 50s you might have some mainline Presbyterians who would like make fun of you for still believing in the virgin birth, or think you were kind of like small-minded because you held that Christ was the only way to God and heaven. Now the shift was you're seen as a bigot because you think a girl is actually a girl.
Jeez. Yeah.
So that's a shift. What he's saying there is like they have now the rejection is broader than a particular Christian doctrine.
Gotcha. It's the whole.
Now it is a Christian doctrine of the creational norms, but it's the norms that most of at least Western civilization and according to Lewis, maybe most of man throughout history have held to. They've come and they've dug that up and thrown that aside.
If you want to grow in your confidence in knowing what you believe and why you believe it, if you want to ground your faith in biblical Christianity and step into who God has called you to be, I want to tell you about a great program put on by Impact 360, and it's called Propel. Propel is a one-week transformational leadership and discipleship experience where high school students gather together to be grounded in a biblical worldview as they learn how to follow Jesus, have a godly influence, learn how to disciple their peers, and boldly live out their faith in their daily lives. So they're having 2 sessions this summer. The first one is June 19th through the 25th, and the second one is June 26th through July 2nd. These programs fill up really quickly, and I promise you will not be disappointed. So we'll put the link below if you're interested in looking into it, and we'll see you this summer.
Indeed.
And so now, if you're holding to those quote unquote traditional morals or natural law or the Tao,
oh boy, okay.
You are in conflict with this major movement that has been going that direction for a while. So these seeds, he was dealing with this stuff. I can't remember when this book was written.
40s,
was the 40s, 1940s?
Something like that, I think so.
But this was already being taught back then. But what we've just experienced in the last 3 years is it caught fire, like a California wildfire, and just went through the trees. Like it went through government. Now like whereas before you you wouldn't have companies that were openly quote unquote woke.
Yeah.
So like it would have been weird to have Victoria's Secret models. Like as Christians we would rightfully have spoken against Victoria's Secret all along, right? Because it's an affront to God's order. It's selling sex. But we would have thought it odd for them to begin to highlight like an overweight woman.
Yeah.
Or a man that is pretending to be a woman or whatever it might be. So that's the new part of it. Like, so this, what he points out, this other, and I can't remember the guy's name offhand in the negative world, but he said, there in American history, there are times when we weren't faithful to the Tao, quote unquote.
Okay.
So you had you had slavery, you had Jim Crow. It was a hypocritical disobedience to what should have been made clear by the image of God and that doctrine and the kind of equality and dignity that God bestows on every human being. But you still had the Tao to appeal to.
Absolutely, to help.
So the founding fathers were, in a sense, hypocritical, but they still were operating within the Tao. They were still operating within this sort of natural law framework. And then Martin Luther King could later come along and appeal to that and hold them to that and say, be consistent with that. But the difference is now is they've used those past sins to actually like almost a tool or weapon to destroy the entire framework. And so that was like, I think that's what we didn't see. Like that's why you get some Christians be like, well, things have always been bad. They don't understand the fundamental shift that took place. There's a major difference between not living up to the Tao and then rejecting the Tao altogether.
Whoa.
And that's what Lewis's point was. Like, if you get rid of this, you lose everything. Like, there's nothing to appeal to. You are in this dark world in the midst of nothing, and all you have then is a nightmare of power plays. You have the World Economic Forum, basically, and this elite system where they see, you know, the leading quote unquote elite thinkers like Yuval Noah Harari see human beings as basically biochemical bags that you can just treat like a mouse. And then you can basically socially engineer them. You can hack them toward whatever end you think is your utopian vision. And so and you can say nothing against that, because you can't appeal to things like, no, human beings have dignity and pre-political rights to life, and we have worth. No, not if the Tao's gone. If there is no objective order that's built into the cosmos, then there's nothing for Martin Luther King to appeal to argue for civil rights for any ethnicity. And so what these guys have done, it's kind of a genius move, you know, a wicked genius, but it's a genius move to use those things where America has fallen short as a wedge. And that's what BLM, that was the brilliance of BLM, I think. They took this slogan that sort of came like borrowed from a Christian worldview, that we think that, for instance, Black Lives Matter because all human lives matter. And it's this idea like, be consistent, like, so they're appealing to that. But really, once you dig into the organization, you learned that it was just Marxism repackaged. They wanted to get rid of the free market. They wanted to tear down the nuclear family. Well, man, what was the worldview behind that? Well, when you understand it, and they even claim to be trained Marxists. Well, they were trying to deconstruct the social order that was in place and reconstruct another one to equal out power dynamics. And in doing so, you know, thoroughgoing Marxism tends to be atheistic, and communism tends to reject the Tao and rework the whole system in terms of these equal outcomes in this radical egalitarian system. And so that was the trick they played, and many Christians unfortunately bought into it as well. I didn't see it coming for whatever reason. And I think now people, thankfully, are kind of waking up to that, but I don't think still that they're seeing the other cases where that's happening. And speaking of the World Economic Forum, so this is their yearly conference, Davos, Switzerland.
Okay.
They just had, I think they're either having it now or just had it last week, the biggest attendance of world leaders to date.
Jeez.
And if you're not familiar with that, you know, you can get online and do a little research on this thing. But Klaus Schwab is one of the, you know, kind of spokespersons, leader. He looks like a Star Wars classic character, and or a, you know, I don't know.
And just
German
listening to him
dictator.
speak, it's like, what in the world? Where is he from? It's like, it's very interesting. His worldview is scary, and it's definitely godless and sounds, you know, that's the thing. There's another book that C.S. Lewis wrote called Screw Tape Letters, and in the beginning of the chapter he says, you know, don't it's a book about a head trainer trying to train his little devil on how to trick Christians. And he said, you know, don't present what's true, present what's clever and what catches on, what's trendy. That's what's going to lead people. And I think that's what's happening today. These slogans and these worldviews, I think at first they appeal to, you know, they're clever sounding, but if you don't really look into them and really see what it leads to.
Here's an example of that. if you remember, like the Biden's platform and many of the Democrats a few years ago, they kept saying "Build Back Better."
Build back better.
That was a World Economic Forum slogan that many of the world leaders were parroting that phrase. Okay. So we should have asked, like, what do they mean? Build what? And what does better mean?
Right. Because right now there's a lot of rebuilding and building. It's bananas.
And so their utopian vision that they are building is very much godless. So if you listen to these guys like Yuval Harari, he calls, God, it's kind of goofy, but he calls the resurrection fake news and fairy tales, and God is fake news. We don't want some God in the clouds. He says
he says we don't need a God.
Right, we don't need some God in the cloud. We have the cloud, the iCloud or whatever. They want to transhumanists. They're very much like another book Lewis wrote,
hacking human beings,
right?
Through
called,
data,
the fictional version of Abolition of Man is a book called That Hideous Strength, and it's part 3 of the Space Trilogy. And it's basically, these guys are right out of that book. Yeah. Like, he really saw this coming. And so I think we're at that point now where you have this post-Christian radical, weird mix of science and the occult and world leaders that if it wasn't right there, you would think it was baseless conspiracy theory, but you really can go look it up. And though they use veiled language, it's clear, like, the more you understand of where they're coming from a godless framework. They are basically using, like I said, these Christian terms to undermine the Tao and the creational norms so that they can remold all of reality in this image that they have that they think is utopia.
Yep.
And the crazy part is, so one of the guys, and I can't remember if he passed recently or not, but Larry Fink was like the leader of BlackRock Entertainment. Okay. He was apparently the wealthiest man, trillions, and the wealthiest one individual in all the world. BlackRock has control over basically everything, like every big business, every big corporation, you can look back and most of them are connected with this BlackRock thing. And he was on the board of the World Economic Forum.
Okay.
So these ideas, like whenever you see these slogans, Build Back Better, even the way they were doing with the Ukraine stuff, all that stuff was connected to these guys that have a vision. So you need to ask, like, what is that vision? What are they deconstructing and what are they trying to build in its place? And that's what we've got to understand. I think that this concept that Lewis lays out in the Abolition of Man is like, he nailed it in the 40s. Sure. We've seen the blooming of it. So when you ask, man, has it been like this? Yeah, it has been like this for a while. I think we're seeing it come out more and more now for whatever reason. It's being made more present. We're being made more aware of it, whether it's through the internet and just all these people that are exposing this stuff, but it's becoming more clear. And so I think as Christians, we first of all, we want to discern like, what is that thing? We've seen now that basically the deconstruction process has happened societally. Like the everything's demolished. It's just, we drove by this junkyard the other day. Remember that?
Yes.
And like that's society right now. So what are we going to do with it? Well, there's a few things. I think we do still have to sort of like red pill people and make them aware of it. We have to like help them see like, okay, here's what's going on, just in case you're not aware. Because sometimes we're in our own world, we're doing our own thing. We have to be alerted. Like, we ring the bell, we say, here's what's going on. And then you have to say, well, here's the ideas and the circumstances that led to this place. But you can only do that so long, right? Without just getting discouraged and angry. Like, if that's as far as you go, it's shown, well, another thing happened. Another drag queen show came to town. Yeah. Well, another election was stolen. It kind of like, it really can just take the wind out of you.
Yeah.
And we can become Christians who are just upset, angry all the time, or just kind of like give up and just play video games and hope that Jesus comes back soon, or that, whatever, we die in our sleep and go on to glory. Or we just, withdraw from society completely. But, that's the challenge, is like, how do you really build in this time? Like, what do we do? Right?
Mm-hmm. And one thing I remember in the book, and I'm sure I'm butchering it, but like we have to remember that, be aware that progress isn't always progress in the sense that culture is receiving it. Progress can be just change, but not necessarily a good move forward. And be discerning, and that rejecting the Tao, quote unquote, doesn't remove the Tao.
Right.
God is still God. He is still on the throne. You can reject him, doesn't mean that he.
And that's a great point. Reality is reality. It has a nature.
Reality.
And what happens when you reject it is not that you actually change it, is that you end up running into it.
You will run into it. And I think we probably need to be there for those who have rejected it, and then they will run into reality and hit a brick wall. And we hold the answers as Christians who understand how God created the universe, how it is, our identity is in him, and the awareness that, I've read studies that children are being taught in public schools that they were probably birthed in the wrong body, that there's a rejection of God's creational norms. And so it's catching on. Parents are even taking kids to these drag queen shows and things like that. But I think if the body of Christ continues to hold on to his truth, to be there to hold the answers, and to just walk in his light and continue. And just because darkness is present doesn't mean the light goes out. Yeah. We have to continue to walk in the light and hold the truth and just spread it. Be the light, and it's not fun. It's hard at times, but we are sometimes being a Christian means standing, and in that you are pushing back the darkness even as you just stand in Christ. And so it's crazy times, but I get discouraged sometimes too, but I have to remember, God is on the throne, and we are living in God's universe for such a time as this, to see how God will use us in these times to be aware, A, to be a light, B, to hold the answers, to walk in his light and his power and his love, and to discern and to be available. Yeah,
that's great, baby. I think you're right about that. And I think so with dealing with that, with the rejection of the Tao, I think it helps to understand, because some Christians, I think we made a tactical mistake, and I might have said this in a previous podcast recently, but it's like when you're playing basketball, and they're playing a zone defense, but you're running a man-to-man offense.
Okay.
You're just running the wrong offense, and you're not going to do as well. Like when they're playing a zone defense, you have certain offense structures that you want to run against that are going to enable you to score better.
Okay.
I think as Christians, we've been they're not, we're just gospel centered. So we're just there, we're going to go out there and proclaim the gospel. We're not going to worry about the culture wars. Oof. And so what they don't understand is what's going on is different than what they're responding to. The campaign right now in our culture is not so much to tear down the specific nature of the gospel, of the good news of Christ. What they're tearing down is the very background that the gospel can even be heard against. So the Tao is what's there, like it's God's creational norms that show us who he is, who we are, and that we've fallen short of it. And they're the things that inform society building, so that you can even have something to then know that, man, okay, we need Christ and it's grace, because we've basically sinned against this order of God in the earth. So you can't even really understand the gospel if you've allowed the Tao to be rejected. Oh, and that's what Lewis said. You can't give the prescription if you don't have the diagnosis. Like, what are you being saved from? It's like, so if you think like you can hide and being gospel centered from the war, it's not possible. The Tao, like if you lose that, you lose the whole structure upon which the gospel fits worldviewishly. So it's almost like saying, like, I'm not worried so much if people believe in God or not. I'm just going to preach Jesus.
That's real deep.
Well, if God doesn't exist, what is the nature of Jesus? Like, you know what I'm saying? So it's like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, even from a logical consistency place, if you lose the Tao, if you lose the embedded rational moral nature, then there's no structure that can actually hold the good news, because it's heard within the context of that worldview.
Okay.
So there are lots of more things that in addition to that is the existential threat. It undermines everything that you can even, the order that you can even build things on. And so, like you said, what we're called to a time is this. What do we do, in this moment? And that's where kind of like I'm shifting now, like as a matter of emphasis. So like where I might have been spending like 80% of my time like just exposing and just talking about here's what's going on. I think we still have to do that some, but as far as like the amount, I'm going to lessen that and then talk about more on the positive side of like, okay, how do we, since the deconstruction process is happening and happened pretty much, like what are we going to build now? Because sometimes the greatest, really, and I've noticed this even with my family, like people that have been impacted by the rejection of the Tao and its fruits, because it does, it destroys people, destroys societies, it destroys individuals. So they're a walking mess, but they see a family functioning, not perfectly, because none of us are perfect, right? But they see a family functioning more or less within the Tao because they've been redeemed by Christ. And because of that redemption, they look to those principles of creation and God's commands to live their lives by. And when they live their lives by that, it tends to bear good fruit and flourish. So they look at a family like that and they see something that's right about it. They see something beautiful about it.
That's really good.
They encounter someone who does business from a truly biblical perspective. And so it's excellent. It's good, it's solid, it's honest, it's integral, and there's something right about that. Or they might even encounter, believe it or not, a politician who says, no, Jesus is King of Kings, which means he's actually king over politics as well. And so I'm going to do my politics from that perspective. And there's something that even an unbeliever who's rejected the Tao, because of the image imprinted on their soul, can still say, man, there's something to that. So I think that while we're exposing things, now we got to get busy building. And get busy like raising up the next generation. And I think even Jared Longshore, who we started with in season 3, Where Do We Go From Here? He recently put out a good blog, and for him, he gave 7 steps. Like 7 steps, what are we going to do? And the first step was like, get your kids out of government schools.
That's true. He says
and
that.
And so, because basically, I mean, that's a whole nother episode, but that's what Lewis was dealing with in this book. Like he was talking about a primary school book. I think it was primary or high school or something like that. But he was like, man, if we are educating these children to not have chess, as he called it. And you cannot live. You will get rid of mankind. The very nature of man will be abolished. And so we have to understand that our government schools, basically, even if you get the CRT out of it, like there's so much rot in the very essence of the curriculum they've been teaching for years. And so I think he's probably right about that. We need to do a longer episode on that. But basically, what we want to begin to think about is like, okay, while we're exposing this stuff, what do we build from here? How do we plan biblically? And then begin to execute those things in 2023. It's going to be probably small beginnings. But that's where we can start. Did you have something to add to that?
I think that attempt to rebuild is internal on a personal level, where people are, I think I sense people desiring like things like the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, those things, but rejecting the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. So there's an opportunity to say, okay, here's while we desire these things, we're created this way, and here's the source. But wait, the source is the creator, the source, the sustainer. And so I think there's an opportunity. And then on a big scale is just understanding that people want goodness in culture and in our nation. And so you can't have your cake. You got to understand that, this is God's house.
Yeah.
And so you can't reject God's house and try to rebuild it on your own terms. And so that's an oversimplification of it. But then in essence, I feel like that's what people are attempting to do, reject God, but yet want his benefits.
Well, because ultimately the rejection of the Tao is the rejection of God. I mean, it goes back to the garden, right? We want to be God.
We want to be God.
And I think the extreme place to where you eventually get to on that road to autonomy is rejecting his order. I want to recreate the order in my image. And so it's in that sense it's really not new.
Yeah.
But I think what's new about it is for it to catch on to that degree and to get pushed through these institutions and just shoved down our throat day after day. And so this isn't a battle we can opt out of, but we do have to figure out, okay, what's the wise way to overcome in this moment? Because it's not always, one of the things they pointed out in that conference is, head-to-head combat with a stronger opponent is not always wise. And what they meant by that was like,
okay, what do they mean?
When communism comes in, the one man versus the state, the communism crushes the one man. Like, sometimes you have to think more strategically. And we know that God is greater and he's stronger. Greater is he who's in us than he's that's in the world. But in on another hand, like, you don't want to go, for instance, if America had faced the British Army just in head-to-head in the American Revolution, they would have got blasted. They had to figure out new ways. There's all kinds of things where even in Scripture, like, you had strategy and you had ways and you had to have God with you. But it's like when you're taking on the culture war, you don't want to just go out there and think, man, I'm going to take on YouTube by myself, or I'm going to take on Spotify. Like, it's going to take some prayer. It's going to take some coming together of the body, some figuring out, like, how do we respond now that we're in negative world, from a place of spirit-empowered wisdom. But we can't opt out. We have to understand what we're up against.
Understand the battle. Have
clarity of the nature of the attack, and to stand at that point and win the battle. So that's hopefully what we'll get into more in this season. So thank you guys for just coming back and being with us. I know we took a couple months off, so we appreciate you coming back and giving it a listen. If you can, go ahead and subscribe. It helps us continue to get the word out, help us promote it on social media, whatever. Hop on. We might actually get on Twitter. That's another story. I might get back on Twitter.
Gosh.
But for now, you can catch us on the gram at Free Mind FM. And we'll see you guys soon.
Blessings.